does fear in childhood do to you? And when I say fear, I'm not just talking about terror fear, the kind around being punished. I'm talking about fear, or even worse, I'm talking about fear of extreme disappointment, fear of a parent's mood, fear of a parent's changing mind around something, fear of making mistakes, walking around in a state of chronic threat detection in the absence of real threat is what is called chronic hypervigilance. It is not an active and reactive state to threat, like a lion, tiger, or bear is approaching and we must do something to survive. It's what happens long after the lions, tigers, and bears were often our own caregivers. And now we perceive everything as a threat in a persistent state, except most of the things we think are threatening are not threat. Like I said, making a mistake, having your partner appear upset with you, the chronic scanning for fear that changes really the course of our lives. I'm a licensed psychologist, and in today's video, we're going to talk about a study that I just recently found. I've been doing a lot of work on research in 2023, 2024, and really no later than 2021, looking at trauma, autism, and ADHD, and trying to understand the impacts in our lives. When I talk about trauma, I'm really talking mostly on my channel about relational trauma, and often at the hands of caregivers. Your essentially trauma wounds from attachment wounds. And so today's video is really about what happens to us, the outcome of living in a state of panic and fear and threat detection within your own home. I was going to share another video, which I'll be doing later this week, on autism and being highly sensitive, being an HSP, the overlap, differences, all of that. But right now, my best friend, who has a mom much like my own, is and has been in the hospital with her and in the process of likely losing her. And it has been really devastating. And a different path, given that about 6 years ago, I went no contact with my mom at the age of 50 after trying damn near everything and her just becoming worse. In fact, I've shared my mom, I think in many ways, while she had a lot of things she did that were not okay in childhood and traumatic, a lot of the wounds that I've had at her hands have came in my adult life. And the same is true for my friend. It wasn't like, oh, she struggled to parent, as a parent, and now she's better. It was bad then and it just got worse. And so we have a lot of connections, you can imagine. But it just made me think about how she deals with fear, how I do. And honestly, as I keep saying, why I'm here is that I had no idea that this thing I'm talking most about, this scanning people needing to read and making responsive interpretations around pleasing, fawning, fleeing, fighting, whatever it was, or not fighting in my case, conflict avoidance and self-silencing, was all related so much to my childhood and, of course, to my brain most likely too, because hypervigilance, for example, is the great overlap, the great connector in my mind between trauma and autism, especially because both experience it in similar and different ways. The study I want to share is titled "The Effects of Parental Presence on Amygdala and MPFC Activation During Fear Conditioning." What does that mean? Basically, they took some kids and they hooked them up to brain scanners and they exposed them to loud, sudden sounds. And some kids were allowed to have a parent with a hand on the child or on their leg while they were in the scanner, and some kids were not. And they measured on what's called often the fear center of the brain, the amygdala, and also the medial prefrontal cortex, also involved in how we respond to fear. And they observed that the kids that were able to have a parent present, no surprise, were able to face that discomfort, that fear, that trigger much more easily. And we know that kids who have more secure attachments are more likely to have a soothing parental presence. The thing is, it made me think though, okay, so if a safe, healthy, present parent is helpful, what happens if that same parent is also the source of fear and the source of safety, as in what we find in disorganized attachment? So we're going to come back to that in just a second and talk about disorganized attachment briefly, and then what I believe are the significant damages that fear, living this way in childhood, really does to your life. But no surprise, like I'm saying, they found that parents teach children not just through responses like, oh, don't touch that stove is hot, through what's called fear conditioning. They teach a child, right, to learn to protect themselves. But also just the mere presence of the parent also acts as a source of safety. Now, here's the thing. There's a dilemma when that same parent, as I've talked so much about eggshell parents, isn't always bad. That maybe they might hold your hand or encourage you to do something or prep you for a speech, but turn around and also scream and yell or give you the silent treatment and stonewall you and ice you out. What I call kind of loud eggshells. They're yelling and screaming, and quiet eggshells, silent eggshells, where you're still walking on eggshells. It's just you're not scanning necessarily for screaming and yelling. Potentially, you're scanning for their ignoring you or making certain sounds or, walking in with their keys and slamming them down on the desk but not speaking to you. All of the things we've talked about, we learn to become conditioned to and to be fearful of because a parent's world determines our world. And so that is what the study talked about. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. Like, of course, it makes sense that the kids who had this experience were more able to tolerate fear and anxiety and nervousness. But what happens, like I'm saying, if that same parent is the one who taught you to be anxious and fearful of people at the core? So when we talk about something like fear and attachment, we're really at the core often talking about disorganized attachment, or what's also called fearful avoidant attachment. Many of you know this, where two big things are true. The source of safety is also the source of fear, the same caregiver. And the parent's mood and mind and world spill over again and again and again into the child's world. Now, there's a lot of things going on, and there's a big spectrum for those kind of parents who would be considered disorganized. And there's some overlap with parents who are anxious, but the fear part, like I'm saying, is kind of the big differentiator there, really not knowing what to expect. So we know in the more anxious version of attachment, there is a lot of unpredictability, but there's really a lot when that's combined with fear, like I said, in some degree. So parents who have this type of attachment really can struggle with all kinds of things. At the core, it can be, of course, trauma, something like borderline, also trauma often related, ADHD, impulsivity, autism, bipolar, immaturity in some way. And we're talking about parents who struggle again and again and again. All parents have moments of losing it. Ideally we don't, but it's not realistic. And most parents make repairs and own their behavior and try to work on not being that way. But a lot of parents get stuck in this like chronic, good guy, bad guy behavior where they're fine, they're good, they're great. I've called it good love and bad love. And then the kind of love where they're screaming and yelling and all of that. And so there's a lot going on with that. And in fact, in my course, and this is really why I created this course. It truly is. And I'm going to talk about it more. I was talking to my literary agents, which I'm very much hoping we're working on a book idea. And I was talking about my courses and how I'm just not a good salesy person. And they were kind of saying, it's so interesting, like many people in your field who are in the helping professions, you all create these courses, these books, and then you're not really motivated to push them because you don't want to push them. But really, if you made something that you love so much, what about seeing it through that lens? And that reframe has really helped me to say, I really do, and I did make these courses with every ounce of love I have, and every bit of personal and professional experience. Many of you know that I share here a little bit here and there, more and more, because I think it's so much more valuable to know that I didn't just find a textbook and read this to you, that I grew up as well with parents who I fully believe both have disorganized attachment for similar and different reasons. The point is, in this course, I have, if you also want to access 3 free lessons, you can check the link down below. And that includes these 2 assessments on the trauma personality and kind of try to figure out, like, do you live in a state of chronic hypervigilance? And then it also talks about the trauma personality breakdown, which, if you look here, the first concept is fear. How fear creates hypervigilance, which is chronic, like I said, and I believe hypersensitivity, which then kind of drives us to do things like fight, flight, flee, fawn, things like that. But what I want to share is this page here, which is the eggshell relationship checklist. This, to me, is the essence of often disorganized attachment. It is about parents who struggle in some way with mood and mind, communication, self-awareness, repair, boundaries, often a lot of enmeshment, parentification, like a lack of maturity in many ways that creates an old soul. You're so mature in you because really you were always the parent. And in essence, it is walking on eggshells out of fear, because maybe they're just going to, I say maybe like it's minimal, but they're going to just suddenly snap at you, or they're going to rage at you, or they're going to ice you out. Whatever it is, like I keep saying, your internal well-being is directly related to your parents' internal and external well-being. So the bottom line is these parents, like I'm saying, have lots of different parts of them that struggle. And so it might look like the parent, the research talks about, was frightened and frightening. So they were frightened in their own trauma. Maybe the baby was crying and it triggered them, or they were frightened, or they were looming large and scary in the child's face. They might be out of it, dissociated, unable to manage any real sense of regulation emotionally. They might be absent for long periods of time. They might have substance abuse issues. They might experience their own active trauma in the relationship with the other partner. But again and again and again, because of their difficulties, you're exposed to that state of mind and mood. And like I'm saying, at the core, there's some sense of fear that wires us to always be looking out and making meaning. So detect, make meaning. Detect, make meaning. So what does it do to you? I really believe that fear drives so much of who I had become in my life, but I had no idea until I was in a doctoral program and really kind of got the pieces together to make sense around why my mom was the way she was and why my dad was and how it affected everything I did. And if you'd asked me, are you traumatized? Are you afraid? Of course, we've evolved in terms of our trauma lens. I would have said, no, like I had a difficult childhood. My mom struggles, but I would have never seen that my fear lens, my fear of rejection, of not being good enough, of others being mad at me, of me not doing well, of me not doing my best, of upsetting anyone, of self-advocating, any of that felt impossible because of it. So, of course, it drove things like being a compulsive caretaker and a pleaser, of avoiding conflict and really silencing my voice, like I'm saying, of feeling a deep sense of shame, even though once again, I would have said, no, not really. I mean, of course, when that word became more popular in the world, then it became like, oh yeah, we all have these elements of shame. But the bottom line was this fear of how I stayed in detecting people, which is chronic hypervigilance, and how I made meaning, and how I was afraid of kind of lots of things around the world, really has shaped who I am. And like I said, I have cat hair everywhere. I just also groomed my dogs. I feel like I have Pomeranian hair everywhere. It really is this sort of driver of who we often can be. So what does it do? Number 1, fear, the panic of upsetting a parent that kind of translates into our lives, often creates wide mood swings between anxiousness and avoidance. Anxiousness as in, please don't leave me, you're mad at me, you're upset with me, I don't like unpredictability, do 5 emojis today and 2, the day before. Does that mean something about how you feel about me? Just like chronic overanalyzing anxiety and social anxiety and things like that. I want to also keep saying there's a big, probably neurodivergence piece in there too, but we're really focusing right now on just like this lens, okay? And then avoidance, this thing where, as I've said, I would have never identified with avoidance at all. I would have fully said, oh, I have anxious attachment. I wouldn't have said disorganized either, especially because of the way it's been described in the more clinical population, which can often look more like the highly clinical borderline PD population. But the point is, the avoidance was this. I would choose someone who would only get so close and who would never push me to fully be in the circle where I could keep my walls up. Choosing a partner who traveled, unconsciously, or at least being okay with that, too okay with that. Alone, and saying, oh, well, I'm alone because I'm an only child and I'm good at being alone. But also feeling at times deeply lonely. But the point is, we create these walls of vulnerability and we often don't know it. Number 2, as a result of that, fear makes us not trust people. If you cannot trust your own caregivers, who can you trust? This is the essence of attachment theory, that we learn what to expect, what our value is, what is normal, what we long for. And even if we say, oh, I know what my style is and I don't want that, we often reenact that trauma. And at the core, there's a mistrust about people when people have not been consistently reliable and safe for you. Number 3, fear makes you live in a state often of increased arousal. That is that fight or flight, the overly activated nervous system, which is that sympathetic response again and again and again. Like I'm saying, that eventually lands you in, that sounded weird, eventually lands you in a chronic state of detection, even when there is no fear to detect, but you see it in everything. You see anger in faces that are neutral. You see someone upset with you from a certain tone of voice. They might be, but you're always making meaning through that lens. And so you're living in that state, which often depletes your nervous system, and because of that flooding of stress hormones, affects your health. And now you have autoimmune disease, fibromyalgia, PCOS, chronic illness. We know from childhood adversity research, the adverse childhood experiences or event studies, that these types of experiences in childhood, these exposures to traumatic big T traumas and little t traumas, literally shape our functioning inside our bodies. It is not just our mental health, it's our physical health as well. So risk of cancer, diabetes, all kinds of traumatic brain injury, maternal mortality, risk of disease acquisition, all kinds of things. So you live in that state that you might just think, oh, I'm just like a really anxious person. Oftentimes it's a lot more than that. Number 4, fear impacts how you sculpt and shape your identity in terms of who you think you are. So what do I mean by that? First of all, when you've had to rotate around caregivers, you often only know how to rotate around other people. You sacrifice self at their expense. Many of you know this, right? Around fawning and compulsive caretaking. Like, I over-identified with being mommy and caretaker and wife and completely lost myself in my marriage. And with 4 kids, there wasn't a lot of time for self sculpting, and all I ever wanted was to be a mommy, a stay-at-home mommy, because I grew up in daycare with a single parent and really no one else, and that was my fantasy of healing. It was a fantasy in many ways, but I did not know that at the time. And so the point is, we don't really know who we are often because there's been no time, especially through our different stages of development and identity. And in fact, even in this course, one of the lessons is a whole lesson on Erickson's stages of development, and talking about how different wounds at different stages of life and different things we're supposed to be able to manage and become masters in can be affected by our traumas. So the point is, you often don't know who you are, and then the way you show up in the world, it's kind of like a mask, a trauma mask, really. And so it's like, do I overshare or undershare? And of course, once again, things like neurodivergence can affect this, but it's like, who am I and what is my goal in how I show up with people? Oftentimes we don't know, or it's not a real reflection of who we are, or it's really a trauma mask and personality in response to those things. Number 5, fear makes you feel out of control, and it makes you often want to be in control. And so it often can look like you being overly controlling, you being rigid or bossy. It can certainly affect how you use control and how you use or don't use boundaries because you didn't have those modeled. But the point is, many people, and this is like the kind of the double-edged sword here. It's like, on the one hand, when you had no control in childhood, it is a good thing to have some control over your adult life. The problem is it can go so far that it becomes an illusion, right? If I can just manage everything and everyone, I will finally be okay. And that is just often not true. Number 6, fear drives, as I said earlier, compulsive caretaking, fawning, people pleasing. The fear of rejection, abandonment, not being enough, not getting your needs met, of not really knowing who to be except for that rotator around others will drive you to make your life and world about other people, and it will have a direct impact on your own life, your own health, your own self-neglect, your physical health, not going to doctors or dentists. I've talked a lot about like, oh, we don't take ourselves like, oh, there's a mole there, I should get that checked out, and ignoring that, or having symptoms that are concerning and ignoring them. But we'll take our child day 1 to the doctor, right? And so there's a lot of that is really about a sacrifice of self to the extreme. Number 7, we often have rapidly shifting mood states. We might dissociate. There's a lot going on for us when we've been living in a state of chronic hypervigilance and fear. And so we don't know how to deal with even normal human emotional flows. And in our home, we witnessed often so many extremes. Everyone was good and laughing, or mom or dad or parent was screaming and yelling or not speaking to us, and we were all tiptoeing. There's a lot going on inside that often can create our own trauma inside, responses that create these mood shifts, and we don't have the tools to deal with them. And so it can also certainly be we've acquired depression, anxiety, OCD, our own, different states of difficulty. And then lastly, fear drives shame. Living in a childhood like this, of panic, creates a deeper sense of like, I know it's not my fault, but what if it is, right? But it is my fault. And when a parent yells and screams and rages, even if that's not at you, it's so uncomfortable and painful to feel and experience that, it's like if you start yelling, even your dog will do this, right? It's like there's something going on there that is very clear to, living, breathing things around that kind of engagement. And we absorb that like a sponge again and again. And if you're living in a state of detecting and fear, and you're cloaked and soaked in shame, it is going to affect every area of your life. So if you do these things, if you're a parent, if you grew up this way, it's really important to look at what role does this fear at the core, which drives how I read people, their verbal, nonverbal communication, what I think my job is when they're upset. Even with my kids, I've talked about like them being upset can be really difficult for us as parents to tolerate, especially if no one comforted us, or if we're really hard on ourselves and we think it's our fault, or if we feel out of control, we can't fix it for them. My kids have said to me, Mom, and I know on other videos I've said this, you can't fix everything, like relax, it's been an exercise. It's still something I struggle with. And then being a psychologist makes you think, oh, well, I can pull these tools or that tools, and sometimes things just don't work, And so the bottom line is, if this is you, it's really helpful to begin to research disorganized attachment, fearful attachment, to look at the role of fear in, how you read people in terms of, do you think that you're always in trouble? How much do you do or not do for people, including your own family, your partner, your kids? Are you afraid to let them have any separateness because it scares you? Are you overly connected to things? Do you overshare and overspill your own adult life too much? Are you stuck in a bad relationship where you yell and scream a lot, and even though you're saying, I don't yell at my kids, they hear that? Are you really harsh on yourself? Do you lack self-compassion? Do you beat yourself up and expect yourself to be all good or you are all bad? That splitting dynamic is very common in both narcissistic and borderline parents. And I found that as their kids, we can do that too. So we see ourselves as all good or all bad, right or wrong. So trauma therapies, DBT skills, I have those in this course as well. Polyvagal nervous system theory skills, nervous system regulation skills, DBT skills, which are dialectical behavioral therapy skills that were initially developed for those with borderline. There's a lot of really good stuff around tolerating distress and mindfulness and mentalization-based techniques. I have those in here too. And so the point is, and also in this course, it's full of not just education, but exercises. And pretty much every page has different, skills and questions and self-reflecting strategies. But I promise you, if you really sit back and look at how often you do this, it might actually be shocking to realize that even though you don't see yourself as a fearful person, that deep inside the fears of rejection, of abandonment, of harm, of being alone, those things are often driving your life. And for example, they might drive a big reason why I think many of us with these kind of childhoods often isolate, because it is the only time when no humans are around that we can feel fully relaxed and safe in our bodies. And I know I say that a lot too, but I think that that's a huge piece of it when you are living in that state all of the time. So that is it. As I think I said in the beginning, if I didn't, I'll be posting more this week on autism and HSP. And I know that you are not loving the quality coming out from the TikTok reposts, so I will make videos most likely in this format. I have a child coming to visit me, one of my older sons, and he will be in this room, so I'll probably be making content, I don't even know where, not a car maybe, with hopefully this mic. In fact, I'm probably too far from the mic now. So anyway, expect that, and thanks again for being here.